podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. Students of color educated in high-poverty urban schools have traditionally experienced low achievement. However, there are some high-poverty schools serving large concentrations of students of color that achieve high levels of academic performance, though these trends don't tend to be widespread. So what if we could identify these systems and structures in the high-achievement schools that have been shown to produce a positive impact on academic performance by facilitating effective strategies in the classroom and within the school itself? Well, to address this topic, we have Dr. Shaana Berman back on the show with us today, and we're going to be talking together about her dissertation, Overcoming a Legacy of Low Achievement, the Systems and the Structures in a High-Performing, High-Poverty California Elementary School. Shaana is a board-certified behavior analyst with over 20 years of experience, working directly with children who have autism and other conditions that impact behavior and learning. She has extensive training in early childhood and special education, applied behavioral analysis, developmental assessment, curriculum design, IEPs, and training teachers to deliver effective instruction to diverse populations of students. Her current focus area is cognitive behavioral training and developing continuing education content for teachers, behavior analysts, and parents. Shaana, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be back.
It is nice to have you here. Thanks for sharing your dissertation with us. I'm very excited to talk about this today because you have some very cool findings that has some great application, particularly in the season of our nation, I think, that's talking about education and the importance of understanding race and equity and all these things that come into play about giving people opportunities to reach their fullest potential. As we jump in, give us a quick summary of the purpose that was driving your dissertation. What were you looking to do?
Well, I went to USC, so it's located in a very urban part of LA. And there's a focus in the School of Education there on education in urban settings. So we had a cohort of 10 to 15 people. We're all working on the same questions, but a slightly different route, slightly different place to collect data or whatnot. But the aim of the study, the overall aim, was to look at what was going on in high poverty, high performing schools. So in the past, we had seen a lot of theories and research that suggested that people in high poverty areas, students in high poverty communities, were sort of predestined to underperform due to things like, deficits. So the deficit model, which would suggest that there's something deficient about some cultures and kids are coming to school unprepared because of that. And things like, when they're in poverty, they might be malnourished, they don't have prenatal care, there's all these things that are impacting them before they get to school, and therefore they're predetermined to probably achieve lower. That's why they're experiencing lower academic performance than other students. And what we saw was that there are some clusters of schools where that's not true. So they're high performing schools in very high poverty areas where 100% of the students are on free and reduced lunch, which means that 100% of those students are below the poverty line. So the school district does provide meals for those students in the school setting. So we looked at those schools and we wanted to identify systems and structures school-wide that were in those locations that were contributing to the high performance we were seeing among large concentrations of students of color. So we were specifically targeting urban elementary schools, large concentrations of students of color that are very high performing. So we looked at our API scores and other statewide testing scores and things like that to determine, is this a high performing school? And what's contributing to those students doing so well there.
I know you did something in addition to that. You talked about going a step further and to explore some practices that are oftentimes part of the experience of students of color. Tell us about that additional step.
Right. Well, I came from a special education background, so I was the only one in my cohort that had experience with not only special education systems in the public school setting, but in private service distribution as well. So ABA services and other services that were provided outside of the school setting. And I was seeing some research that was showing that there are overrepresentation statistics for students of color in special education in certain areas. So, for example, students of color are more likely to be referred for special education assessment.
Yeah.
And once they are assessed, they're more likely to be found eligible as needing special education. And in terms of eligibility, on our last podcast, we talked a little bit about eligibility categories for special education. And so we were seeing that some students of color were more likely to be placed in categories like emotional disturbance, which is sort of a soft disability category. It's not a diagnosis. It's just some characteristics, and it's related to, the lower academic performance that those students were experiencing. So I was looking at those things and thinking, are there systems and structures in place in these schools that are high performing that are keeping students out of special education? Are they experiencing lower levels of overrepresentation? And the way we looked at that was, for example, if there is a certain percent, say there's 10% of the students' total enrollment at that school, 10% are African American, for example, but in the special education programs, we see 25%. African American in those. So, they're overrepresented based on the number there are in the school. Why is that? Right. And it was very interesting to look at what was keeping them out.
Yeah, your stats in your dissertation, when you're citing some of the concerns here in terms of the representation, you were saying there's Black kids about 3 times as likely as white kids to be identified as special ed, and twice as likely to be found eligible for, like you're saying, for that emotionally disturbed, diagnosis here. And the concern, and I love this dimension of your dissertation, because you're talking about when they are referred and placed in, we're going to be talking about placement versus services. I really want to highlight that piece too, because it's a cool part of your dissertation. When they're put in a placement for special ed, they tend to have lower quality of support in the services there. And they're typically placed in more restrictive, settings, which cause that unnecessary segregation. And you talked about once a student of color is labeled negatively within a school system, this label can become an ingrained and defining feature of their own identity. And then it gets to kind of trickle down and limit some of their overall academic, abilities and their social opportunities. This is key.
Yeah, definitely. I heard somewhere, and I don't have the reference, but something that said the way we talk to children becomes their inner voice.
Yeah.
So what these kids are hearing about, who they are and what they're good at and whatnot, during those formative years in elementary school and things like that, becomes maybe an unconscious part of them that guides them to make certain choices and not other ones, or to, I would never go for that job because how I wouldn't do it, or why would I go to college, or, those kinds of things. And I actually lived in a very urban, high poverty environment for quite some time, where most people were under the poverty line and no one was going to college. That was seen as sort of a ridiculous. Why would I do that? I need to go to work. I need to make money. And I remember helping a daughter of a friend of mine who graduated with fairly good grades from the high school she was at to apply for college and to also apply for financial aid, because then the other part of it was, that'd be great, but we can't afford it. And I was like, wow, you have access to money though. And we talked about, I believe, cultural and social capital last time, but the network of information, that pipeline of how do I access services, that wasn't there, but I had it. So I was sort of like the gatekeeper, of services and of the process. And I just felt very strongly that I needed to help her. And I did. And she's at a Cal State school and she's receiving funding and will be the first person in her family to go to college.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
So it's very exciting. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of nice when we can give forward like that, isn't it? And help someone all you're doing is helping her reach her potential and giving her a path to do so. But that's huge. Yeah. There are people oftentimes. Yeah, exactly. Opening the door where she can go through. I want to jump into some of the research and your findings, your conclusions, and I want to tee up in just a moment what are the research questions that kind of organized and formed your dissertation. But in a minute, give me a sense of what inspired you to pursue this focus on your dissertation. Maybe it was part of you, what you grew up in and what you were seeing and the path you're creating for some people in your life. But what inspired this?
So during my career as a special educator in the public school setting, and also as a provider of in-home ABA services and some other types of consultation, I had already observed certain disparities, and they were bothering me. So for example, we had a very large district that I worked for, and one corner was high poverty, and the schools there looked different, and the staff there looked a bit different, like the facility wise. I mean, the parents there maybe didn't speak English, so they weren't aware of what they could be getting. And I was seeing some disparities in terms of teacher quality. So the teacher with less training was getting a student that really did need somebody who had a lot of training and maybe had been there a little bit longer, was more experienced. But if the family didn't understand, I was seeing that those students were likely to be placed in particular classrooms, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that doesn't make sense. We should place based on need. We should try to match that need with that experience with staff there.
Right.
And I felt like, looking at those factors that could improve equity of experience and outcome for students of color in educational settings, I felt like that was on the forefront of my mind at the time. And I wanted to explore that. So it was nice I was able to weave that into the overall question that our cohort was investigating.
Really good. Really good. As you share that, I can see why your research questions and what your dissertation was about, how it got shaped and formed. What I want to delve into now is, again, I want to find out what your research conclusions were and what some takeaways were for you. But let me let our listeners know what research questions kind of formed and shaped a framework for your research and what you were looking to find. You're asking first, what were the trends and patterns in academic performance among students of color? You're also looking at what are the organizational structures and systems that contribute to high student performance in high poverty schools with large concentrations of students with color, and how do they use these structures, and this is the additional piece, to prevent or reduce the overrepresentation of students of color in special education. Third, you're talking about how our schools' organizational structure and systems are being implemented such that they can promote a school-wide effective classroom instruction and promote student learning. Really cool. And then lastly, you talked about how is a construct of race reflected in a school's systems and structures. So these are great questions, because what if we could find some things that we could replicate, that we could generalize to other schools that can really have a lot of bang for the buck if they can implement these things? And this is what I'm seeing your questions frame for your research. So give us a sense. What did your research reveal? And what are some of your conclusions that you walked away with?
Well, we did find that, yes, this is a high performing school and that students were achieving high levels of academic performance school wide. And they did not overrepresent students. They didn't refer as often, and there were not any students of any category overrepresented in the special education setting there.
Got it.
So that was kind of the generalized finding. And then I looked more specifically at what is going on at the school, because again, previous theorists had thought, well, it's something that's happening outside of the school setting or before the child starts school that is then impacting their ability to learn when they get there. And I think a huge takeaway from me was that, well, no, not necessarily, that there are things we can do at the school site to promote high levels of academic achievement among all students.
Can I highlight something here around that? Because I want our listeners to remember that these are findings where you have students with high performance, but this is a high poverty school. Important reminder.
Yes.
So we have this level of poverty, we have this level of significant concentration of students of color, and yet we're seeing these performance things. So you're talking about at the school, there's high academic levels relative to other schools of similar demographic characteristics, and you're saying, how come? What are we doing here? What are you guys doing here? And this is where you begin to delve in. Tell us about some of that finding.
I think that focus on the site level is very important, because oftentimes teachers, experience burnout. Teachers are historically overworked and underpaid and all these different things, and taking work home, especially special education staff. Special education teachers are constantly going above and beyond what's happening at the school site. It takes a certain person, I think, to be a special educator, because you really need to have your heart in it and want the best for those students. And I did see that reflected in what was going on at the site level. So I think it's significant that, we can point out there are things that you can do at the site level that will have a very significant impact on what's going to happen for those students there in the future. And teaching, in terms of teaching quality, having a collaborative focus and a school-wide system, a focus on achievement and a focus on instruction and all these things, it facilitates teacher quality as well, because everybody is talking to each other.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Behavioral and mental health professionals provide critical support to our communities in a time when our communities need it more than ever. But they need support too, to continue their education, to connect with colleagues, and to advance their career. And so we've launched Triad, the hub for behavioral and mental health professionals. At Triad, you'll find education, community, and career resources for both current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, all curated specifically for you and all for free. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT to register for your free professional account. Again, that's hellotriad.com/BHT. Come join the community today.
One of the cool things in your research, you had some findings, like almost like a before and after. You had some 2004 data, and then you're coming in and saying, hey, but wait a minute, look at the performance taking place now. And you're talking about there was a correlation between administration and all the things that began to come into play once this began to shift in that manner. I'd love to hear, because it sounds like there's a number of categories or a number of characteristics here that are significant that we can highlight, measure, and then again, like we talked about, replicate. Tell us about those.
Absolutely. So you're talking about the dramatic increase in API scores that was experienced at the school in 2004. And we looked at, those statistics and noticed, well, that correlated with a change in administration. So there was new leadership at that school. There's a new principal, and he did things like empower staff to take on leadership roles. So there was transmitting and sort of empowering others to do leadership things and to be accountable and responsible and empower others themselves. So it's sort of coming down, down the mountain like a trickle, he's at the top and he's empowering others, which then frees that principal up to do other things to support the school. So one of the things I noticed was I had interviewed all these people. I had interviewed some parents, and they all mentioned this, that the change in leadership was very significant in terms of the turnaround at the school. They said that the school was, I believe the word trash dump was used, and the office smelled and there was just trash everywhere. And it just seemed like no one was proud that their child went to school there. There was no school spirit. There was no anything, because the symbolism there was like, well, no one's taking care of anything. And this principal really changed that. And one of the big things that we found was a school-wide system character education program that focused on positive behavior and support. And, when we look at research and when we look at learning and performance, we can see that special education students in particular, if they're put in exclusionary settings for disciplinary reasons, so suspensions or expulsions or detentions or timeout or whatnot, they're removed from the learning environment. And they have less opportunity to learn. There's less time spent on instruction, so there's less time for them to learn what everybody else is learning. And we also know from research and statistics that students of color are much more likely to be given exclusionary school discipline in terms of, being suspended or expelled when another student might not be for the same offense. So if you're getting suspended and expelled more often, then you're not in the learning environment as often. And of course, you're going to miss things, right? Yeah. So this school-wide system character education program, it was a system in place from kindergarten all the way through, when the kids were done with elementary school at 5th grade. And it was reinforced and supported by everybody at the school. It was reinforced by the paraeducators, the principal, the teachers, and even the office staff were constantly talking about earning tickets and reinforcing, good behavior and knowing things about the students and their families as well, and being able to support, congratulate, and reinforce them on positive things that they were doing even outside of the school setting. So having that relationship with families was very important, which we then saw an increase in parental involvement. And then parents were able to sort of, well, I know what the goals are here. I know what my child's supposed to be learning. I'm proud they go to this school. So that was very, very significant too, that parents were more involved and they were starting to learn the process, the network, that, opening the door to services. They knew how to do it. They knew what the focus was on at the school. And that brings me to another point, was that there was some specific goal setting there. So there was a grade level collaboration that went through all the grade levels. So 1st grade, they knew what kindergarten was doing and vice versa. And kindergarten also knew what 5th grade was doing and vice versa. So everybody knew what everybody was doing and everybody was focused on the same goals. And one of those goals was an 800 score, which is perfect API score for their students. And that expectation, it was sort of built in. It wasn't, we are going to have high expectations. It was, we do, we think we can do it. And they had a huge bulletin board right when you walk in. This is one of the things that I remember the best is I walked in and I saw to my right, a big green bulletin board, right where you walk in to the school past the office, and it says 800 or bust. And they had a graph kind of where they were before 2004 and then where they were now and where they wanted to be. And every time anyone walked by that, it was like 800 or bust. And it was sort of a very cool symbol that was used. Yes. It wasn't like, I'm going to put symbols of different cultures here. I mean, that was there. But really the focus was on, I'm going to put symbols of what our goal is, where we are right now. And everyone's going to know what that is, because that really kind of unifies everybody. And now it points them towards a common goal. It's a common mission, it pulls everyone together and it gets them oriented towards the same destination, which was the 800 score.
I would love just to kind of name that just real quick, if I could with you. Right now we're talking about, we're at a place where we're kind of splintering, as groups and everything else. And that creates more segregation, that creates more tension and everything else. What you're talking about here, that's such a uniting goal, is you're using words like our and us and we. It's not different people in all of this. It's us as one family, as a school. And you're saying that it's our culture, it's our school. And this administration comes in and says, this is our goal. It's 800 or bust. This is what we're all doing, regardless of where you come from, what you look like, what your SAS is. It doesn't matter. This is our goal. And somehow there's something about, and you mentioned this in your dissertation, teachers had these rigorous expectations of all ethnic subgroups, encouraging in this mastery orientation. I love that idea of rigorous expectations. As an educator yourself and in this field, why do you think having rigorous expectations with the bar at 800 is a perfect score, you said? Why have that?
I think that it's a symbol of, believing in not only the staff believing in themselves, but having the students believe in themselves, because we've seen a lot of research. This is a very significant study that researched the Pygmalion effect. I'm not sure if we correlated this last time.
We did the Rosenthal effect, yeah.
Yes. And expectations.
Name it again for us.
Yeah, expectations were correlated with performance, meaning so they had two groups of students matched on demographic characteristics and et cetera, achievement characteristics, whatever. And they had one group that was called the low group and one group that was called the high group. And they told the teachers, you get the low group, oh well, and you get the high group, good, have fun, right? And what they were on equal footing at the beginning of this, but the only difference was the expectation that had been transmitted by this label. And we saw that students in the low expectation group underperformed, even lower than they were expected to perform.
Simply because of the expectation that was assigned to this group that was just the same as the other group in the other classroom. It was just the teachers being told this. That's all that it took.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the high expectation group actually overperformed. So there was also that. It was like, wow, they performed even better than we expected them to perform. And what is that? Why is that? There are all these different reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with students feeling that they are welcomed, that they trust their teacher, they trust the other students. This character education program had put into place that there are things that we're not going to say to our friends, and we are going to, in the classroom, have a culture that supports everyone else's learning. And we're not going to shame people if they make a mistake. And actually, I actually witnessed a teacher telling the students that making mistakes is an important part of learning. So the students weren't afraid to answer questions. They weren't afraid to make a mistake. And I think that level of trust and security is very important in the classroom. Given some of my own personal experiences with mathematics when I was younger, I definitely felt sort of shamed and it was a black or white thing for me, where I ended up thinking that I was not good at math, which is a static black and white type of perspective. Like, you're either good at it or you're bad with it. And not only that, but you're kind of born with it or not. So I'm having trouble with this. And that just must mean that I'm not good at it, because there's lots of people that are not having any trouble. So it must be me. And that actually directed, my college, experiences and everything else. I was planning to go to medical school. And I thought, well, I can't handle the math. I know I can't handle the math. So
your whole
I'll do a
path
different
changed.
thing. The whole path changed. And I came from a
because
very
of that
different
expectation.
environment. Yes. I mean, I had amazing teachers that were very rigorous in terms of what they expected academically, but in terms of feeling safe, welcomed, and supported in the classroom, I did not feel that. So I know firsthand how important that is for the students to
There's really a crossroads. Yeah, well, there's really a crossroads moment there, isn't it? There's if a child is, let's say, struggling academically up at the board, or there's a child acting out behaviorally, we could look at that as that's a moment that needs to be judged, and sometimes it gets shamed in the process of addressing it. Or it could just be a child, like the subscript, where they're, as they're struggling at the board or acting out their behavior, it's almost like the translation, like a subscript in the movie is, hey, in this moment, I need some help. And I hope that you can join me in this moment because I'm struggling. And this is the best way for me to demonstrate it. Are you going to shame and judge me? Or are you going to come alongside me and say, hey, this is a learning opportunity. We're either winning or we're learning. There's nothing else. And that's what you're saying this school is doing. And that's what you're saying makes that safe, kind of familial atmosphere, this cultural shift that the students, the parents, the staff, and the kids all got behind. And it's almost like, hey, this cultural change, this is us. Let's go swing for the fence. What a different environment.
It really was. And I saw other things in the classroom that indicated and sort of transmitted this type of culture. So one of the things I noticed, though, it goes right back to goal setting. So the students, they knew what the content standards were, and they also knew where their own performance was, and they were self-monitoring their own performance. So they were like, I took this math test and I got these ones right this time, but this one I'm still getting wrong. So I need to work on this one. So they were very aware of what they did know and what they didn't know, which is very important because then they knew where to focus, any review that they needed to do. There was a lot of group work in there, a lot of collaboration among the students. And in one class, again, because of probably my personal math experiences that were a little bit negative, I saw groups of kids, 3 to 4 kids in each group, working on math problems. And they were sort of arguing over who was going to get to do the toughest math. Or which one is the hardest one? Mrs. Smith, which one is the hardest one? We want to do it. No, our group wants to do it. I'm like,
who does that?
Kids are fighting over who gets to do the hardest problem. I would have been under the desk, like, please don't call on me.
Right, exactly.
So, it was very, very different. And I think self-regulated learning. So these were elementary school kids. They were not high school or college, but the expectation was still there that they would be able to do this, that they would be able to monitor their own performance and make decisions about their own learning. So self-accountability was there for them too, so they knew, and they were all motivated to achieve that 800 or bust. And everybody knew that their part was important.
I love that piece. Everybody has a part. And it's not you better perform. It's hey, what can we achieve here individually and collectively that really begins to shift that. And this whole task mastery orientation you talked about increases their student engagement and also the persistence on those tasks. We're kind of turning a little bit of a corner here in our time, but I want to weave the extra step you took. And you're talking about this classroom setting. And you mentioned in your dissertation this idea, does special education become a placement where kids go to, and we know what can happen once they get placed there, whether it's the support they get, the services they get, the segregation that occurs, maybe even the label that kind of goes with that. Or what if the special education is really just an identification of somebody needing to come alongside a child and maybe not so much have a placement, but make it a service? Tell me about that part.
Well, and we're talking about inclusion there too. So, being able to support students in the general education environment with everybody else, and what services do we need to put into place to do that? And oftentimes we have kids that are underperforming for one reason or another. There may be a processing issue going on. There may be something going on in there. And as I said before, students of color are more likely to be referred.
Yes.
So the perception of that is a certain way in some places. And once they're referred, they're more likely to be placed in an exclusionary setting. So if we have a lot of if we have a 5th grader performing at a kindergarten level across the board, it would be very difficult to implement goals in that type of IEP in a 5th grade classroom. It would be very difficult. It would sort of be like they're on their own island over there doing something totally different. But there would be opportunities for that student to have interaction in that environment to the extent that is appropriate, given what their strengths are. Are their strengths, whatever, it could be talking, social skills or whatnot, giving them the opportunity to be in that environment, and also conceptualizing it's not my students and your students. So I did see that a lot too. Well, he's not my student. So no, I didn't even read the IEP. Yeah. And I'm like, but you signed it. That's a legal document. You have to, please don't say during this tape recorded meeting with a lawyer that you didn't read it, because that's not your student. These are all our students. And I think sometimes we see that perspective based on a lot of different reasons. Well, that's not my responsibility.
Yeah.
So viewing everyone as, the responsibility of everyone, these are it's like a family. It was like a big family where everybody was very vested in positive experiences for everybody else. I also noticed too that if there were kids that were struggling, like you were saying before, that might need somebody to come alongside of them and help them out, they were actually referred to something called intercession. So this was sort of a little bonus instructional time where they provided pre-referral intervention between, like, during breaks and such. So the teachers knew how the students were doing as well, very specifically. And they knew those students and they knew what had happened the year before and the year after because of the cross grade level collaboration with the teachers. Very strong team. So they were able to pinpoint, okay, this child missed this foundational step back here. So I'm going to refer them to intercession. We're going to work on that, reinforce, and then see how they do when they go back to class after. And that, I believe, was a very significant factor in terms of keeping kids from being referred for special education. Nobody wanted those kids to be out of the classroom. Everybody wanted everybody, in the class.
How cool is that?
Their kids, right?
How cool is that? And what you found in that too, you said when you manage it in this manner, students of color are not going to, or are less likely to be, and at least in the case in your research, they were not over-identified. It was some of the categories we talked about earlier. And what was really cool as I was reading it, it's a service versus a placement. There's some special ed needs, let's say, just using that word for a moment. It became a service where it gets woven into the classroom. In fact, there were no special ed classrooms on the campus, meaning it all took place in the classroom. How awesome is that?
I'd actually never seen that before. I mean, usually I would see, like, the special ed classroom was always a portable on the outskirts of town, way over there by the, parking lot or something.
Yeah.
So it's very exclusionary. And even those teachers that worked in that environment, the special educators, they felt excluded too.
Absolutely.
It was sort of where do I sit at, like, whose table do I sit at lunchtime for both the students and the teachers that were teaching them? Really felt like they had no home. And this was very different.
In your literature review, you were talking about some of the elements within a school. You talked about, you named them as effective school correlates, what you're describing here. These are the things that correlate with this high achievement, even if you're in a high poverty school with a large group of students of color. And you cited in how these correlates can produce high performance, regardless of a student's background. And the dissertation is kind of creating this template or list of ingredients for success that are so applicable. You also cited Marzano and some of his list of factors that positively impact student achievement, and yours kind of match with his, where there's this great opportunity to learn, proper use of time, monitoring and measuring, like the 800 or bust. Love that. Pressure to achieve, good expectations, rigorous expectations. And not just, hey, good luck, you guys are on your own trying to hit an 800. It's no, here's how we're going to help you get there. Parental involvement, school climate, their identity, that tone within the school, leadership, cooperation. These are some terrific findings that you found. And these are the factors that can really be built into any school program, can't they?
Yeah. And I think, like what we said with the dramatic difference in achievement occurring correlated with the leadership change, it does come top down. I mean, you need to have the support of that administrator. They need to understand these things, and they need to view themselves as an empowering facilitator, I believe, like a servant leader almost, somebody that's there to serve and to lead. And I also think I cited Bowman and Deal's 4 frameworks for leadership, which were structural, meaning what are the systems and structures? Are they efficient? Or are there any in there that are kind of, what? The copy machine's been broken for 2 months. Nobody cares. And so no one's making any worksheets. So no one's really, doing that. And those kids aren't getting as much time spent on instruction because that teacher can't make their materials. That would be like a structural thing. The symbolic part of it, though, was very, very prominent at the school in terms of the things I was seeing, like this focus on achievement. The whole school was focused on achievement, and it was very specific, like you said. And then in terms of visibility, I noticed that too, that the principal was highly visible and prioritized the needs of the parents. So there was one time where, I had scheduled an interview with him, and this mother came in speaking Spanish, very upset with her child there with his backpack looking at the ground. And I understood a little bit of, they had come home with some money that wasn't theirs, and this mother was very upset, and he bumped me. And I was sort of seen as oh my goodness, here comes this doctoral researcher person, and he had no problem. And I was glad he did it. I was, wow, that's another example of how he's showing commitment, understanding, support for these people. And I think that that goes a long way. Administration really can help either pull things together and guide, or sometimes not so much.
Yeah, not so
Yeah.
much.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good. As we're kind of winding down, if you would speak to our listeners, is there a message that you'd like to say regarding your experience in this research, and maybe some takeaways that you'd like them to have?
Sure. I think when I thought about this, something that I kept thinking was that we are all different. That's true, but we're also all the same.
Mm-hmm.
So by that, I mean that, we may share certain cultural and social and physical things. There's certain characteristics that are common to a certain culture or race or ethnicity, for example. We all have our own individual experiences. Even identical twins are going to meet slightly different because they may have the same genetics, but they have different experiences that they're going to perceive and interpret and use as they go along their path, and we all have different levels of understanding as well, and awareness and perspective of others. And so
Yes.
I do have an ethnic look. And when I was younger, I was always asked, what are you? And when I was younger, I was like, what do you mean? And then when I got older, I was so sick of hearing that, because I thought, well, I'm a human being. What do I look like to you? And I didn't really like that, why do you need to know that first? What does
Yes.
that mean to you? That if I tell you that, are you going to make some sort of preconceived judgment about me, or why are you asking that? I just didn't understand. And the person sometimes would just keep asking, no, I mean, what are you? Where are you from? Well, and when I meet somebody, I'm not as interested in where they're from as much as I'm interested in who they are as a person. What's their energy like? Yeah. What are their likes and dislikes and things like that? How do you feel about a certain thing? So I guess what I'm trying to say is we all do have our own feelings and opinions and our motivations, which are shaped by personal interactions and experiences. And people are at different levels too of self-actualization and understanding, and that's okay.
Yes.
And I think we can just endeavor to meet anyone at their level in general, whether it's an educational environment. And I see myself as a facilitator of growth. And I think that's a helpful perspective to have, is that I see myself as a facilitator. Even in parenting my son, I view myself as a facilitator of growth for him. The only difference between me and him is that I'm older, so I'm more experienced. Mm-hmm. And I can impart that experience to him to help him learn to make his own decisions and make good ones with the benefit of my experience. So, learning is a social process, and being a top-down deliverer of information only, I'm not sure is as helpful as viewing it as a group social. We're social animals, so
it's such a relational process, isn't it? At its best, it's a relational process. And if we're going to be focusing on something, let's focus on the relational piece and making it safe and warm and inviting. Let's focus on the potential and our ability to have high expectations, and let's go get them. Let's swing for the fence. This is us. Let's swing for the fence on this. Absolutely. Yeah, that's really good. Hey, as we wind down for today, I would love our listeners to have some access to resources about you, your work. Give us some direction here.
Sure. I'm online. I have a website at www.metamindmagic.com. And I can also be emailed directly at shaana.berman@gmail.com. And that's spelled SHAANA.BERMAN@gmail.com. And I'm on social media as well. So you can find me on Facebook under Metamind Magic as well.
Really good. Really good. Well, Shaana, thank you for being with us today. It's always great to have you on the show, and really enjoyed our time together.
I did too. I love connecting and getting to talk about these things and disseminating this information so that it can help others as well.
I think it does. I also want to thank our listeners. Thank you for joining in as well. And we will look forward to seeing you next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tribe Network, all rights reserved.